Okay, there's slide number 1. So I'll start off with my own opening, and I'll end up with my own closing, but in between it's going to be a lot of other people that I found were fascinating and usually better writers than myself.
Did the lights dim? Did the lights dim at all?
Oh,
No, it's either on or off.
really?
We're gonna turn them off then. If anybody, I apologize for not asking. If we did off, we did off.
We didn't get here in time to get the ladder out and unscrew the light bulbs. Oh my.
Okay.
We have a problem. I can't read my text.
Tell you what we'll do, we'll open those doors and turn the light on back there.
Oh, okay, go ahead. You know which switch it is. I found out it's the first one.
Yes, not the first one, we're supposed to shut the lights off.
See, you did the same thing I did.
I did the same thing.
Oh, okay. All right. Here goes, people. Okay.
We'll solve it.
All right. This is the story of a place. There are people in it, many different peoples, over the past 4 centuries alone, and the things that they did and said and made and left behind are the result of their being in this place. While this is true of everywhere that humans have gone, there are places that are so different from their surroundings that one finds oneself thinking and acting a bit differently when there. The Great Lakes are home to such places. Among them are among more than 10,000 miles of shoreline, where often one cannot see the opposite shore, there are a mere handful of places, choke points, where land nearly touches land. These narrow passages, carved by ice and water, offer access to both the connected lakes and to the lands on either side. There, one may expect to find people, past and present, taking advantage of what is, in every sense, a crossroads. The indigenous peoples that gave their names to these places were such as Boiting, Ongiara, Michilimackinac, Bequejiwanaw. Today they are known as Sault Ste. Marie, Niagara, Mackinac Straits, and the St. Clair Flats, respectively. Each has a distinct character, a treacherous rapids, a stupendous cataract, a fog-shrouded narrows, and an immense freshwater delta. In their presence, things must be done differently. Dangers faced, obstacles overcome, and rewards gained.
While you're flipping that, Dan has books and he'll be signing and autographing and selling them in the back at the end of the night. Sorry, forgot to mention that beforehand.
Set up shop here. Now, one of the first people to come through this area, as far as the French missionaries go, was named René Brehon de Galinée. He came through in 1670 and kept a rather good diary. He did an interesting map there, and so in his diary, his account, it was published later on, he said, first of all, this is down closer to Detroit, near Spring Wells, not too far from the area that is now Fort Wayne. And they had been paddling up from Lake Erie up towards Lake St. Clair, which they didn't know was there yet. So he says, at the end of 6 leagues, we discovered a place that is very remarkable and held in great veneration by all the Indians of these countries because of a stone idol that nature has formed there. To it, they owe their good luck in sailing on Lake Erie. The place was full of camps of those who had come to pay their homage to this stone, which had no other resemblance to the figure of a man than what the imagination was pleased to give it, and a sort of face that had been formed for it with vermilion. Now, being good Catholic missionaries, they decided that this was an abomination, and so he says, I leave it to you to imagine whether we avenged upon this idol the loss of our sacred vessels. One of their canoes had capsized the day before, and all of their altar goods had disappeared into Lake Erie. So I think he was sort of feeling in a vengeful mood. We attribute to it even the dearth of provisions which we had hitherto suffered. I consecrated one of my axes to break up this god of stone, and having yoked our canoes together, we carried the largest pieces to the middle of the river, and threw all the rest into the water, in order that it might never be heard of again. God rewarded us immediately for this action, for we killed a roebuck and a bear that very day. So this is your introduction to this area here. Again, we have missionaries. Father Louis Hennepin was the missionary, or the kind of the chaplain for the La Salle expedition a few years later in 1679. He kept a very extensive diary as well, and he talks about entering the delta of the St. Clair in ways that really kind of set the tone for all sailors would have to face for the next, 200 years, let's say, till the mid-19th century. He says, the banks of the strait are vast meadows, and the prospect is terminated with some hills covered with vineyards. Trees bearing good fruit, groves and forests so well disposed that one would think that nature alone could not have made, without the help of art, so charming a prospect. If you wade through all the verbiage there, what he's saying is that God must really love Frenchmen, because here God has provided this wonderful landscape with fruit and growing wild. What he didn't know was that this landscape, until a few years previous, had been farmed and basically constructed. It was an anthropogenic landscape, as we say. It was a man-made landscape by the natives of the area who had been decimated in a horrible war with the Iroquois. So this is the Ojibwe, the Algonquian nations had fled clear across the lower peninsula, in fact had taken refuge in what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin. That's how far they ran to get away from this war. So this had been, until only recently, a killing field. So I just love how cavalier, you might say, he is, and say, oh, how nice, thank you very much, God. But then trying to get up into the St. Clair River posed all of the challenges that, as I say, sailors were going to face for many years. He says, there is little depth as you enter and leave Lake St. Clair, especially as you leave it. The discharge from Lake Orleans, Lake Huron, divides this place into several small channels, almost all barred by sandbanks. We were obliged to sound them all, and at the last discovered a very fine one. Our bark, this would be the famous or infamous Griffin, our bark was detained here several days by headwinds, and this difficulty having been surmounted, we encountered a still greater one at the entrance to Lake Orleans. The north wind, which had been blowing violently and which drives the waters of the three Great Lakes into the strait, had so increased the ordinary current there, we could not stem it under sail, although we were then aided by a strong south wind. But as the shore was very fine, we landed 12 of our men, who towed it along the beach for a quarter of an hour, at the end of which we entered Lake Orleans on the 23rd of the month of August, and for the second time we chanted a Te Deum in thanksgiving. So any of you sailors who, on your way to the start of the Port Huron-Mackinac race, have had just a little too much trouble getting under the Blue Water Bridge, you're not alone. You're in a long, long tradition. But having to put guys on shore and tow things up. So in a nutshell, Hennepin nailed down the problems. The twisted, narrow channels, the sandbanks at the front. As these channels would dump out into the lake, they would drop all of their sediment and so on, and this would create a natural sandbar. The prevailing winds were against you, and of course, last but not least, the current, which was always there, in some places pretty bad. Let's see. Now, eventually, of course, there was the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as we call it over here, was fought between the English and the French. And the French lost and ceded all of their North American territories to the British. And so the British immediately move into the area, especially up into the upper Great Lakes, looking to take over the fur trade and have a monopoly on it, which had been part of the reason why they were fighting so hard during this time period. And so one of the people was Jonathan Carver, who was a fur trader, and he was exploring the area in 1768, not too long after, 1766, not too long after they'd taken over in Detroit. And he complained bitterly about the French and their map making, their French cartography. There was a certain amount of intentional disinformation. Now, you've seen enough of the old maps to know that they're not exactly drawn from satellite imagery. It looks like what barely resembles what we know to be the case. But he was a little paranoid about this. He said, I knew many obstructions would arise to my scheme from the want of good maps and charts, for the French, whilst they retained their power in North America, had taken every artful method to keep all other nations, particularly the English, in ignorance of the concerns of the interior part of it. And to accomplish this design with the greater certainty, they had published inaccurate maps and false accounts, calling the different nations of the Indians by nicknames that they had given them, and not by those really appertaining to them, which is kind of true. The Hurons, they don't call themselves the Hurons, it's French from a French word, Huré, and so there was a lot of that. But I think there was some intentional disinformation because there were two maps drawn by Jacques Bellin, and one was in 1744, and it was reasonably accurate. And along this, you see, I don't have a pointer in here, so, but along what is the Thames River, okay, going down from Chatham, it said a river which ascends, was it 80 leagues without any rapids, in French. Now, 1755, when it's becoming obvious that war is imminent, he publishes a revision of the map, and he says a river which mounts 80 leagues but is full of rapids. Also, here's the Thames River, and here is another river where there's a short distance across them. This one you can portage down into Lake Erie and miss the strait altogether. No sign of it in the revised map. So they were using strategic disinformation as a weapon of war. So that was one of the kind of fascinating things that I spotted. Now, I'll skip over the War of 1812 because that's worth a whole topic in its own. But eventually, you have two nation-states on either side of the strait. So the United States and Upper Canada, which is for all practical purposes a British colony, and they were trying to decide on what the boundary ought to be. And there were two boundary commissioners. The chief commissioner from the United States was named Delacorte, and his counterpart, actually a colleague and good friend of his, they were both amateur geologists, was John J. Bixby, who was actually a surgeon. And so on the Boundary Commission, he kind of gave his opinion of the St. Clair Flats. He said, when we arrived, we found the scenery very pretty, the borders of the lake for miles inland being a savanna of long, bright green grass with woods in the rear disposed in capes, islands, and devious avenues. I was delighted and landed for a run, but to my surprise, I stepped into water ankle deep and forthwith returned. But a more serious evil was the bad quality of the water, as we were to be here for several days, and the weather was sultry and close. It was tainted and discolored by the dead bodies of minute pink insects, and was only drinkable after straining and boiling. I don't know about the pink insects, but it sounds to me like he arrived during fish flies.
Fish flies, yeah.
Can you imagine drinking Lake St. Clair during fish flies? So, the natural result of all this was sickness, and while in the lake, the only person seriously ill was my friend the lieutenant. He was attacked by the dangerous fever of the country with great general excitement, delirium, etc., but bleeding, always got to bleed people, and other appropriate measures brought him round by conversion to the common ague, which was driven off by quinine, malaria. I mean, the quinine is kind of the dead giveaway here. And so it kind of got this reputation as being, a fetid, swampy, marshy area that was tough to navigate through and not too healthy to hang around in. And that was kind of the way things stuck for a while. Finally, when steam power came along, I have chapters in the book devoted to steam, the arrival of steam and the arrival of dredging and so on and so forth. One of my favorite writers is Alexis de Tocqueville, who, of course, in his Democracy in America, toured all over the place, but he did a lesser-known memoir of his trip through this area. At one point, he's on the steam brig Superior. This is in 1831, so steam on the Great Lakes has not been around for very long. So he's on the Superior, he says, we embark around, and it is very brief. I'll wait. Thank you. We embark at 2 o'clock. And this is from his diary, so it's very short and telegraphic in style. But shore of Detroit, land low and cultivated, many houses, Lake St. Clair. In the evening, dancing on the bridge, American gaiety. 2 days later, he wrote from Fort Sinclair, which is now the present-day village of St. Clair, Michigan. At 1 o'clock, I go shooting on the marshes on the other side of the river St. Clair. First, we go to the fort. That would be Fort Sinclair. Here's your chance, everybody. Whip out your phone.
That's right. Check your phone and shut them off.
You can do it as a group exercise. First, we go to the fort. This is Fort Sinclair, which is the present-day site of the village of St. Clair. We go to, first we go to the fort. In the forest on the way, the sound of a savage drum, some cries. We see coming 8 savages, stark naked except for a little loincloth. 6 children, 2 men, besmeared with dyes from head to foot, hair bristling, lots of ends falling in a queue behind, a wooden club in hand, jumping like devils. Beautiful men, dancing for fun and to get money. We gave them a shilling. It is the war dance, horrible to see. What a degradation. And as I read this, I'm not sure whether he was talking about his own degradation in, throwing money to the dancing Indians, or was their degradation. And I have to go into this, and make a commentary on it when I bring it up, because what we've got here is the ancestor of the, let's say, Clair Flats tourist industry. They're going upstream, they're going, just take Superior and plug in Tashmoo and just about all the activities there. You're dancing on and dining on the deck of the boat. You're going ashore. You're sightseeing. You've got natives who are coming over from Parsons Island with souvenirs. If you've ever been up to the Algonac Museum there, they've got cases full of souvenirs from Parsons Island and Tashmoo Park and so on. And it's all in nuclear, primal form here in de Tocqueville's writing. This guy was invariably as much as a century ahead of his time, and so he's awfully fun to read. You say, "Yep, he spotted the trend." One of the original influencers, I suppose. And so, rather than end on this, note of the degradation of the natives, who are, after all, who's using who? They're getting money, and they are, by doing so, they were able to preserve and perform their identity, their lifestyle. This allowed them to stay where they were at, and they're still there. Walpole Island. It's First Nations. It's unceded territory. That's the first thing they'll tell you when you hit ground over there. Welcome to Bequechewanong, unceded territory. And so this is the kind of thing that kept this going. And a really interesting incident, not too many years later, was when a couple of Jesuit fathers landed on Parsons Island and decided that they were going to missionize the natives. And they went to this lovely oak grove called High Ground and cut down all of the sacred oak trees there so that they could build a chapel. These are real PR experts, right? And so they decided, the fathers, the elders of the island there, mostly Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Mississauga, decided that they would hear them out. They would say, okay, make your pitch. And so the Jesuits spent some time pitching why they should convert over and everything. And then it was the natives' turn. This was framed as a debate. And one of the rather eloquent chiefs was an Ojibwe elder named Petrokishig. And this is his speech. It says, "It is true that many men of all countries have listened to your words. I look forward to the rising sun and travel toward the setting sun. I look on all sides and I see that everywhere you have made the ancient customs disappear. In truth, the changes you have made in the world are many. I contemplate them and am amazed. Most nations have rejected the blessings of their ancestors. And that, my brother, is what you are asking of me. That is what you are reserving for me. After having traveled far on all sides, you come to me on the small island where I live. Could you not leave me in peace to enjoy the blessings of my ancestor? Soon I will not even remember them. No, that cannot be. I will remain faithful to my ancestor. Here, at least, the fire he left me will burn for me and for my children. So, my brother, do not worry about me. Take no more interest in my fate and let me live in peace on my little island in my humble dwelling." The eloquence is just gets to it. But in time, you can see, there was a slide to go with that, yes. Now, we don't have a picture of Petrokishig, but this is an example of traditional life ways as they were practiced, and what you're seeing on the left, of course, is the harvesting of wild rice. Nature provided for all of their needs. Everything was pretty much occurring naturally, or was cultivated as needed. So all those fruit trees and the timber and so on was all out there. wild rice, of course, actually protected the shoreline from erosion. They didn't need sheet pile seawalls at the time. They'd go out and harvest your seawall. So that's kind of a traditional life way that has persisted. And on the right, you see the monument to Tecumseh, who perished at the Battle of Battle of Moraviantown up near present-day Chatham. And his bones were supposedly taken from the battlefield and moved around because there was some danger of them being, scattered and what have you. But they finally, we are told, were repatriated to Walpole Island, and he was interred in a coffin that was made at the Chris Craft plant, by the way. Since we're talking about Detroit ruling the ways, I've got a whole section of Chris Craft and Garwood, Packer, and all that. But many of the craftsmen who worked for Chris Craft were Native Americans who would commute over from Walpole Island because of their master craftsmanship.
Or Native Canadians.
Are they Canadians?
They're First Nation. They're neither.
Oh, First Nation.
That's right, they're neither.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
Good point.
It's a great zone. Yeah. So that's, as I say, this is the monument to Tecumseh that is standing on that spot now, and that is where the mission used to stand. An interesting postscript on that is the Jesuit fathers said, well, we'll just build another one, and the comment from another one of the elders was, if you build it from stone, it will burn down.
Interesting.
Now, by and by, as I say, more travelers. I consider de Tocqueville to be kind of the leading edge of the movement there. But several noted authors came this way. One of them was Anna Jameson, a British woman who was a very good travel writer, highly regarded, bestseller, and so on. And she had excellent ear for dialogue and spent some interesting time in Detroit. And she was very observant of how maritime culture and steam in particular were changing the frontier. So she says, I was amused at Detroit to find the phraseology of the people imbued with the metaphors taken from the most familiar mode of locomotion. Will you take in wood signifies, will you take refreshment? Is your steam up means, are you ready? The common phrase, go ahead, has, I suppose, the same derivation. A witty friend of mine, there had just been the Panic of 1837, so 1 year later she writes, a witty friend of mine once wrote to me not to be lightly alarmed at the political and social ferment in America, nor mistake the whizzing of the safety valves for the bursting of the boilers. So the steam metaphors were everywhere. Not to be outdone, Charles Dickens came along a few years later in 1842. There we go, there's Charles. Okay, oh, no. Okay, there's Charles. He was, in 1842, he was traveling through the Great Lakes. He has some really interesting comments on plank roads and corduroy roads, but at this point he was traveling by steamboat aboard the steamer Constellation. And writing at Cleveland in 1842, Dickens observes, he describes the Constellation as a large vessel of 500 tons and handsomely fitted up, though with high-pressure engines, which always conveyed that kind of feeling to me which I would be likely to experience, I think, if I had lodgings on the first floor of a powder mill. That's gunpowder, of course. So people were coming through and they were noticing, the culture and so on. A journalist named Chandler Gilman is probably my favorite author who just really encapsulates the experience that you would have at the time. And he was actually on a schooner. Schooners and steamboats were coexisting side by side with some interesting outcomes. So he was on a schooner called the White Pigeon. So he says, for a while, our White Pigeon flew over the waves of Lake St. Clair at a merry rate before a favoring gale. But ere we had gained the opposite shore, we experienced the fickleness of the changeful breeze. The wind hauled round, first abaft the beam, then on our quarter, and finally near dead ahead. This guy knows his sailing. The schooner, however, was well calculated for beating and hugged the wind closely. In this way, we approached the mouth of the St. Clair River. It would have been coming in through the elbow up in the corner of Anchor Bay, trying to get into the North Channel at the time. So they're trying to negotiate the notorious elbow. Here the lake is very shoal and the channel at which there is only about 9 feet water, very intricate. As we drew full 9 feet, our advance was almost hopeless, though owing to a change in the direction of the channel, our course was not quite so near the wind. So they were trying to turn the corner there. Captain N, who was an excellent pilot and familiar with every crook and turn of the channel, determined to make a bold push for the river, and he accordingly placed one of his best seamen, a fine stout Canadian, at the helm, and himself mounted the foregaff to look out for the channel and give the word. A man was stationed at either quarter to heave the lead, and we advanced. The wind was heavy, so we drove through the water very fast. Before long, we began to feel that the keel had touched, and looking astern, could see the muddy water eddying round our rudder. Still, we kept onward. Every now and then, the leadsman on one side or the other would sing out 6, and once 5½ feet, showing that his side was already out of the channel. Now we approach the elbow. The captain cries, "Luff! Luff!" The man at the helm bent his whole strength to the tiller when, snap, it broke short, close to the rudder head. Of course, the vessel was utterly unmanageable and swung right across the narrow channel, pushing her stem deep into the mud. The captain, who had flown to the deck, set about making a new tiller, and in an hour 'twas done. The anchor was now put out ahead, the vessel was lightered aft, she was too deep there, and finally they succeeded in heaving her off. We had the more occasion to rejoice at our escape as we passed a schooner at anchor, taking her lading from a lighter alongside. She had been aground 3 days, and after many fruitless efforts to get off, the captain was obliged to send a trip to Detroit for a landing. Now what you've got here is a pretty good approximation of what is going on. In the foreground you've got a Mackinac boat, which draws a couple of feet, and he is just sliding along. And you can see in the foreground there's a red buoy, so they're going upstream, red, right, returning, right? So the channel is on the left. And so the Mackinac boat's no problem, but if you look over on the right-hand side, there's a topsail schooner that's in trouble. He is outside the buoys, he's outside the stakes that they put in the water, and you can see it's clear enough that he's got lines that are hanging slack here. Here's his main sheet, there's just nothing out. They've pulled it around, they've backed it, they're trying to catch a little bit of breeze to get them back out in the tail. He's using every trick in the book he can to get back into deep water. Their davits are here, they've lowered the ship's boat, and they're probably about to bring it around and do what these guys did. Put the anchor in, row it forward, and kedge off by setting the anchor and winching up to it. So this is like a little snapshot of a day in the life of trying to get through the St. Clair Flats by schooner before there were towboats.
Is it a painting?
Yes, this is a painting. This is by Seth Oracle Whipple, who is a very noteworthy painter. He was a native of New Baltimore. And so, if any of you know Joel Stone, he's the curator at the Detroit Historical, or curator emeritus thing.
Yes.
At the Detroit Historical Museum, Dawson Great Lakes. He sent me a copy of this and said, this belongs to a friend. It's in his collections. It looks like it was painted around 1889 or something like that, right around the turn of the century by Whipple. But it's depicting, judging by the rigs, the clothing, and all of the evidence, this is probably painted about 1850, or it's depicting a scene about 1850.
Can we mention who the owner is?
No, he's asked me to keep it,
okay.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah, at his own request. But Joel says, we know you're working on the flats. Do you think you could figure out where this is? And for a while, I looked at my old charts from the period. And I said, yeah, I think I can locate where this was painted from, to within about 10 feet.
Wow.
That buoy is still there. I mean, not that buoy, but that is NC2, North Channel 2, still at the mouth of the North Channel. And so this just when we got the book approved and everything like that, I begged him to let me use it for the cover. And it's hard to do. So then what you've got over here on the right is the Corps of Engineers hydrography of that area, and showing how tiny and narrow and twisted and ultimately what a bottleneck the elbow was, and how absolutely shoal it was on either side of it. So when they first started using Anchor Bay for getting schooners through there, they were staking the route every spring, and there were bitter complaints from the captain saying, whoever's responsible for the staking, must be in the local lightering industry because he's not putting his stakes where the channel is. And so it's pretty much guaranteeing that he's going to have regular clientele, people who are running aground and needed his services.
Is this where the freighters go today?
No, the freighters go in, this whole route has been pretty much relegated to recreational traffic. So the North Channel going up through Anchor Bay and into, along, by Pearl Beach and all that, that's all local traffic now. Bit by bit, and again, I've got chapters on this. Actually, we will talk about it in a slide or two. Has been improved, dredged, straightened, wider, deeper, straighter by the Corps of Engineers. But this was the kind of the transition point. Now, a clergyman named Calvin Colton may have witnessed the birth of the towing industry, because once you had steamboats that were capable not only of propelling themselves, but towing other stranded schooners and so on, an industry was born. It was really born right here. So all those towboats and barges and that sort of thing that run all through the Great Lakes were born of necessity. And necessity was from getting from Lake Erie to Lake Huron, and as quickly as possible. You could spend 2 weeks getting from one Great Lake to the other, just getting the 80 miles of the strait. And so Colton witnesses an incident aboard his boat. He was a passenger on the Sheldon Thompson. He says, the rest of the night, from 9 in the evening till 4 in the morning, was industriously occupied by running 25 miles to Fort Gratiot. Before all this, running at night would have been inconceivable. To Fort Gratiot, having the double obstacle of a stiff current to stem equal to a rapid and a schooner in tow, which with us was bound for the upper lakes. If this vessel in tow could not classically be called an obstruction, it was at least a holdback. But nevertheless, as the master of the steamer was sure of our money, there seemed no objection in his mind to get a little more for helping the weather-bound ship, although he had never stipulated with us for the privilege. And besides, it was not an act of humility, it was a kindness, and being understood that vessels up or down were often detained in this current, not only days but weeks before a strong south wind springs up sufficiently strong to bear them into Lake Huron. So what started off as being basically hitchhiking soon developed into an industry where purpose-built vessels, first, they would be paddle wheels like the Constellation here, but eventually you'd have propellers with the screw propulsion, and eventually you'd have dedicated towboats that did nothing else but. There's a famous painting, I think it's in Dawson, of the Champion towing 10 schooners up the straits. Well, eventually they wanted to, let's see. Well, there's Colton again. The first one was Constellation. There's a typical propeller in the city of New Baltimore. And she was kind of a little packet steamer. She could carry a little bit of cargo, some passengers, but could tow umpteen vessels as well. So that's kind of the evolution. There's the Champion. I'm glad I've got a nice, friendly audience here as I learn what it is that I'm doing. But that's the famous painting of the Champion. And
That's actually Windmill Point. That's actually coming at passing Windmill Point.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
so that's out the open waters of the lake.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So that's like St. Clair and the River.
Yeah, but they pick up tows basically down here like Luna Pier, down to the mouth of the river, and take them all the way up to Lake Huron, and then cut them loose, because really the steamboat and the towboat prolonged the age of sail on the Great Lakes by making sailing economical in every place except the strait. So what you have is this conveyor belt of towboats that were picking up tows, taking to one end, coming back, picking up another load, and really all the schooners needed was an 80-mile hitch into Lake Huron, and then they could sail very economically on a small crew. So for any cargoes, like bulk cargoes that weren't timely, anything that was perishable, or passengers invariably went for the steamers, but it kept the age of sail going here many years longer than it did, say, on the Atlantic seaboard. Anything else we've got on this slide? Reverend Colton? No. So Israel Andrews was a consul to Canada, and in 1853 he was arguing for the use of the newly invented, patented steam dredge. This was the thing this is the other application of steam that really made navigation through the flats possible. Steamboats that could go exactly where they were pointed, and steam dredges that could make out a straighter route. The steamboats didn't have to tack, they could go against the current and all that. So his report that he gave to Congress read in part, and it was a lengthy report, crammed with statistics, but it boils down to this. The St. Clair Flats, the greatest natural obstacle to the free navigation of the Great Lakes. These shallows lie nearly at the head of Lake St. Clair. The bottom is of soft mud with a very intricate, tortuous, and difficult channel, in many places so narrow that two vessels cannot pass them abreast. There would be no difficulty whatever, but a most trivial expense, as compared with the advantages which would accrue from removing this barrier in dredging out a straight channel of sufficient depth to admit vessels of the largest draft. Nor is there any work more urgently and reasonably solicited than the opening of the flats of the St. Clair and carrying a canal around the Sault Ste. Marie. These improvements would at once perfect the most splendid and longest chain of internal navigation in the world, extending above 2,000 miles in length. So there were really two bottlenecks, where the Soo locks are now and where the St. Clair cutoff is nowadays. So what he saw was an opportunity. This is the natural course of the South Channel here, and this is the elbow up here. This is the North Channel. So this is what they had been doing, is going up into Anchor Bay and waiting for conditions to be right to get through this and hoping that the stakes were in the right place and all that. But what happened later on was they identified this as actually being a much straighter way. If you didn't have to do all this, you could cut miles off your trip by going to the South Channel. And this was an area where a navigable channel almost got out into the deep water. So what they proposed were a couple of options. One was to dredge here, or the other one was to dredge there. They were both about the same length, but they decided on this one here. I'm assuming this thing does not have a pointer, right?
I'm afraid to touch anything on that.
I am too.
Take the focus.
The one time
Cause focus problems, I apologize.
Yeah.
I should have brought my pointer.
That's what happened. And so they straightened out the South Channel, and at that point, you could have not only big, bulk carriers, the ore boats that eventually grew up, the 1,000-footers all, evolved to exist in this landscape, but also that's when it became Michigan's Venice, is that as the current improved and so on, all of those recreational opportunities started to look pretty good to a Detroit now that was industrializing, it was having a population boom and so on. And so in the latter part of the 19th century, well before Henry Ford and all of that, you had the palace steamers. And our friend Joel Stone has written a lovely book on the palace steamers. The Tashmoo is probably the best known one. Is there anybody here who's ever rode the Tashmoo?
No, can I have a question?
Okay.
Who paid for all that dredging? Was there an Army Corps of Engineers or was
Yes, there was. That has a really tangled history because at first, oh boy, you want to read chapter 7. You want to read chapter 7. But really what happened was incredible.
Somebody had to imagine it, somebody paid for it.
And the engineers were, at first, all they did was do surveys. They were just looking for the best routes. But as soon as the dredge came along, it became really obvious to them if they could find the weak point in the bottleneck, they could improve things a great deal, things would be faster and so on. And the biggest problem that got in their way was the Civil War and the politicking that led up to the Civil War, because all of these things call for appropriations. That's where the rubber hits the road here. All of the industrializing states from the Atlantic seaboard clear into the old Northwest and the prairie states and so on depended really heavily on a flow of goods and so on, manufactured goods to the interior and raw materials to the manufacturing centers. So there's an incredible amount of money to be made if you happen to be one of the industrial northern states. But we were shaping up for a civil war. So all of the agrarian South had nothing to gain by this, and they saw that the North would be strengthening its hand by having taxpayers pay for all this. So everything got vetoed, especially by presidents who were kind of Southern sympathizers. So nothing really got done, nothing serious got done until after the war. And at that point, it was Katie bar the door. They just started dredging everything that's in sight. And so gradually it improved, but there was a lot of horse trading just to get the job done. The interesting thing is that one of the secretaries of defense who argued that this was really an urgent matter was a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee. He was the Secretary of Defense in the 1850s. He saw the utility of it, and what he said is, yeah, we'll let you all dredge your channel if you'll also fund building up levees on the Mississippi. Interesting bedfellows, they say, politics.
Yeah. Politics.
Yeah. So by and by, we had Michigan's Venice evolve, where after the war, you've got the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. The westward movement is in full swing. You've got people who are moving through, but they're also settling in places like Buffalo, Detroit, Chicago, and so on. So you've got this urban proletariat that's developing, and they've got disposable capital, they've got money to spend, and they've got a place to go. So, okay, none of us have been to Tashmu, but who's been to Babel? See, this is better. See, Tashmu was the Bablo of Lake St. Clair, right? And so it was a place where you could go and kind of forget your worries for a while, take a nice boat ride. And so what sprung up along the route here were dozens and dozens of resorts. And they started off as exclusive shooting clubs. You know, places like the Old Club and so on had their roots in the shooting and fishermen's shacks, you know, the lodges that they were built out there on the islands in like Parsons and so on. And there, of course, is a picture of the iconic Tashmu. And also you had settlers that would come along and building cottages. This is a satirical cartoon from a Detroit Free Press at the time, where, you know, guys have just kind of built, you know, driven some stakes and built a little shack on it, and he's showing, he's waving his deed. He's got, you know, clear title to his little shack there. And some of those are, you know, still around and been in families for generations. If you know any old Harson's Island families, they can tell you chapter and verse about who was the first one to come out there and build a shack. Now, within a few years then, fashionable, well, just realized that I have a whole paragraph here. Fashionable sportsman clubs had sprung up along the route of the now daily steamboats. In the wake of the exclusive clubs came affordable resort hotels catering to the working class. Day tourists disembarking from Port Huron steamers could spend the day fishing and enjoy a fish fry or frog leg supper before catching the evening boat back to Detroit, dancing to a live band. In an 1895 article on Michigan's Venice, the Detroit News Tribune explained, "And still the crowds come and come. Is there no end to them? Has the whole population of Detroit chosen this special day to go to the flats? No, it is only a fair sample of every Sunday in summer. This is the Sunday crowd." By 1896, excursion boats made no fewer than a dozen stops at clubs and resorts between Lake St. Clair and Algonac. A third class of recreational developer in the flats landscape was the seasonal cottager. Every bit of land that thrusts itself out into the lake, observed travel writer James Kirwood, is lined with summer cottages and lakeside inns. There must be thousands of them in this American Venice, echoed fellow journalist Stuart L. Douglas. It's the most extraordinary for a big steamer to be loafing along here among all these cottages. You could toss the proverbial biscuit from the deck and hit a happy householder in the eye almost anywhere. So this is how, you know, how things develop along here. And of course, along with that comes recreational boating. After a while, it could have been the Depression, or just progress, the Model T, any number of things have been blamed for the demise of the excursion boats like this. But eventually, I think the small power boats gave every man access to his own cottage. And so this, I think I'll have to show up for that lecture about
making waves,
because it really was not only the know-how, all the carpenters and the craftsmen and the engine technology that we had in Detroit, but the guys who were making them had a 2-day weekend, and they were experimenting. They were dropping all sorts of things into boats and, you know, making their own personal watercraft. And so the personal watercraft industry can really, really justifiably be said to have its birthplace right in these waters. So, in conclusion, and again, this is pretty much how I wrap up the book. So across the span of nearly 4 centuries, the warp and the weft of nature and culture, natural resources, and what we brought to the table have produced a tapestry with a pattern, a motif of movement and dwelling with repetitions, variations, and innovations. Not every thread is visible at all times. They submerge and reemerge like the reed beds. Together they tell a story. Better still, many stories, not just a triumphalist frontier narrative, but tales of separation and survival, endurance and identity. We want to know who these mariners and dwellers were. The archival research and archaeological fieldwork described here show promise of strengthening the links between descendant communities, maritime communities, and their heritage, the family history that is embedded in the surrounding landscape. Blessed with such an opportunity, the maritime archaeologist begins and ends as an ethnographer, an observer whose interviews may lead not only to sites, but to the recovery and to the preservation of community identity. In gathering and sharing their stories, we become the storytellers. And so, in fact, some of the slides that have just gone by there are some of the occasions that I've had to be out doing investigation or just sailing or just having fun. And the final shot there is actually, that's downriver, that's in Brownstown, where we were able to tell the story of one of the few Michigan relics, archaeological sites that can be dated reliably to the War of 1812. The military supply road was built to supply Fort Detroit in the summer of 1812. And there was a battle fought on the site because, again, it was a choke point, this river crossing. And when we dedicated that historical marker there, we were doing a little storytelling, and we managed to get it done in time to celebrate the bicentennial of the Battle of Brownstown. And if you take a look there on the right, you will see John Deagle, who I personally give a lot of the credit for getting this done on time and under budget. So it's given me a chance to go out and play around, play in the dirt, play in the mud, what have you.
Okay, before Dan signs books, any questions? Please, or you have more? I'm sorry.
No, this is Q&A time. This is my revenge. This is when I ask you to share your stories. But I consider it a kind of a waste of somebody's time if I come away with this without having learned at least as much from you folks as you do from me. So I saw a hand go up in the back, and then, yes, sir.
Any thoughts on what happened to the Griffin?
I do. Time and time again, we have cases where Frenchmen, who are lovely people, they coined the word chauvinism, right? And they're a little bit chauvinistic about, I think, their seafaring know-how at the time. They made it back and forth across the Atlantic very nicely, but they never sailed Lake Superior, or Lake Huron, or Lake Michigan. They almost lost it at Lake Huron, and at one point they were all down in the bilges of the Griffin, just with their rosaries in their hands, and they got through that one, but it did catch up with them. And one of the reasons was that after loading up the Griffin with an entire year's worth of fur production over near Green Bay, Wisconsin, south of Green Bay, doors of death, they said, okay, now we're going to sail back to Quebec, and we're going to, these will go over to Europe and turn into hats and things like that, and we'll come back and we'll bring more beads and bullets and all the stuff that we're trading. And their native partners said, yeah, but don't do it today. The problem with, especially in Lake Superior, is if you're on the weather shore, you got no chance to see what's coming. It's on you. You don't have 100 miles of sea, where you can see what's coming. And they got hit by a I said Lake Superior, it's Lake Michigan, sorry. But everything I said about it, the Griffin is in northern Lake Michigan.
And if I may, Bob McGreevy will be back in September again for the third year in a row. And 2 years ago, he gave his talk on the Griffin. And that's on our YouTube channel if you haven't seen it.
What does Bob think? What is Bob?
Yeah, he said the same thing.
Yeah.
On the north shore of Lake Michigan.
Yeah. Cherry, what are the islands? Washington Island. They did, by all accounts, they hadn't gone far. The natives were watching them from the shore, and they said at one point she just went out of sight. That was that.
But
So,
part of the issue is overloaded.
not necessarily overloaded. I think that she just bit off more than she could chew. They sailed on a day when they shouldn't have, you know? The problem is you don't have long fetches like you do, again, like a transatlantic crossing. You're constantly, well, you heard the little white pigeon there was saying, the wind is gradual, owing to the fickleness, and all you sailors out there, I mean, you know how you can be going along, it always happens about 200 yards from the finish line.
When you start going backward.
You know? Yeah, exactly. We have dropped the anchor,
Yeah.
you know, just waiting for it to please change. And of course, it always brings in all the people who are way in the back, and as soon as they've caught up with you, have drifted ahead, and the breeze comes back. So Hennepin and LaSalle had their experience with this, but I think they just they sailed in a day when they shouldn't have. So long answer to a short question. One last thing. There was a fellow out there by the name of Steve Liebert, who has made a career out of finding the griffin, and I managed to dodge that bullet. At one point, I was being recruited for the dive team that was going to go up and find his bowsprit. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I don't think it's the griffin. My answer is, she had guns. Show me the guns. You know. Judging by the Bell, which is the other ship that he managed to lose down in Matagorda Bay, they're probably like bronze swivel guns, but they would light up a metal detector. And until I see guns with the coat of arms of the Duc d'Orléans or whoever his sponsor was, I'm holding judgment.
You mentioned the war of 1812. I'm Mariner, I still have a mariner's card, and I get a lot of information on email. A lot of those cannons were dumped in Lake Huron, and they're being recovered on the shores of Canada. I don't know if there's any correlation to what went on in Grosse Pointe Township, but why would they go up, all the way to Lake Huron and dump cannons?
I can't speak to Lake Huron, but I do have experience with the ones that have been found in the Detroit River.
Oh.
If I knew that we could if we had another hour, we could talk about, because I was working, again, my phone rings, Joel Stone. No, actually, I saw the film on 6 o'clock Action News that they'd found another cannon in the Detroit River, and this would have been back in about 2011. Okay. Detroit Police Dive Team was doing a training exercise, and they're down in zero visibility. They call it braille diving, and they're just going along. And this is what they train in the conditions that they have to work in, because most of the time they're looking for evidence, bodies, what have you. But they found a cannon. This is like the 6th one that they found over the years. They always kept finding them in the same general area, which was pretty much straight out from where Hart Plaza is. And so this cannon, they will rust and corrode if you don't immediately start taking care of them. So in collaboration with the Detroit Historical Society and Cranbrook Institute of Science, I oversaw a project where we conserved the cannon. We did electrolysis and all sorts of cool, conservation stuff. Meanwhile, I was taking all the markings and trying to figure out what it could be. Long story short, it turns out that all those cannons that were found in the Detroit River were guns that had been at probably at Fort Pontchartrain, the little fort that was on the shore, not the big fort that they built inland, not Fort Lerneau, because they had much bigger guns. These were small guns, and as a rule, they were worn out. They were probably good mostly as noisemakers. But they had them on the shore. And when Anthony Wayne, the old man Anthony Wayne, finally drove the British out of Michigan by winning down in the Fallen Timbers in Ohio, the British said, okay, we have to relocate. So they moved over, and they moved all their good artillery over to Fort Malden. And so here we get over to Amherstburg, you will find any number of guns that are still there from that. But the ones that were like these, kind of clapped up, not worth saving, but not worth letting them fall into American hands. I reconstructed the timeline of when the orders went down and so on. It was in January of 1795. Any ice fishermen here? You know what happens when you leave your ice shack out on the lake? Okay, and that's what they did on purpose. That's because that was how they built piers too. They build cribs, wooden cribs, fill with stones, shove them out onto the ice and wait for spring. Boom, you got it right where you want it. So they put these cannons all over the place because you're not going to build a pile of cannons. You're not going to want to be that British soldier who's dragging the 4th or 5th cannon out to put it. So they scattered them around a bit, but they're on the same general area. Chicken Bone Reef, if you know the Detroit River hydrography. And so every once in a while one turns up there. So I don't know about the Lake Huron cannons, though. I'll have to look into this. But it could be, again, a case of intentional scrapping. The real thing that told the story was I took measurements of the cannons and compared them to what the spec for a proper gun was, and they were all worn out from overuse. The barrels just get scrubbed out by cannonballs.
I just have a question. The north end of Parsons Island is Russell Island.
Russell, yes.
Is that enter into any of your discussions?
Indeed it does. Let me see now. If we, it's one of my, let's see now, that's more the Highlander Sea, just shooting a freighter as she goes by. But there is a picture in here pretty early on. It's from Google Earth, and it's from one of the here. This is the main one. That may be the schooner Air. She's a centerboarder who was abandoned on the shore. You know, there's about 5 wrecks that are along the Russell Island shore. One of them is probably the barge Champion. This, I think, is the schooner Air. But one of my projects, and I talk about it in the book, is to go and identify as many of those as possible and see what the pattern was. What it looks like so far is intentional abandonment. Guys who had shippers operating probably out of Algonac, who were taking a look at their inventory, saying, okay, not worth refurbishing. They would take a schooner, they put an engine in it for a while, then they take the engine out, and then convert it to a barge. And so a lot of these ended up as tow barges that eventually got towed into position and were being used as breakwaters. There's a bunch of them near Belvedere offshore. So they park them out there to absorb the wave action. That's what you got to do when you let the reed beds, basically die off.
Thank you.
One other question. I've read that some people consider Lake Michigan and Lake Huron as one lake.
Well, considering the fact that there is no drop between them, it's an arguable point. And the thing is, when you look at the Great Lakes, you have to look at them in geological time, and you find out about, things like Lake Stanley, these proto Great Lakes, as the glaciers were advancing and receding and so on, and they're releasing their water or sucking it back up into the ice and so on. And so, the Strait of Mackinac is basically just a narrow spot between 2 lakes. I mean, people who are sticklers for this sort of thing about Lake St. Clair, they would say, well, properly speaking, it's not a lake at all. It's just a wide spot in the river. Because if you look at the natural channel, there is a proto river, or there's a fossil river that runs where the ship channel does, basically, and everything else is just flooding farther, greater or lesser flooding into the interior. So, yeah, you can argue it because mainly because there is no drop.
Great, well, it's thank you again, and